Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. Today I'll be breaking down the changes to Necromancer for Update 41. Since my last video, in the Week 4 PTS patch notes, they made some further adjustments, so we'll talk about those, and I'll give some pros and cons for the upcoming changes as a whole, and hopefully make it a bit easier to understand what's going on here with the current state of Necros. Sorry this one took me a bit to get out. I really wanted to dig into the changes and get a lot of different perspectives on this before jumping to any conclusions, and there ended up being quite a bit to unpack here overall. So let's go ahead and dig into it. First off, I'll say I really like the general idea they have here of splitting up the two morphs of Blastbones into two completely different playstyles. This is a direction I'd love to see for many more skills in the game, as I think it would add a lot of depth to each class by having choices that diverge into different ways to play the class, rather than simply choosing between two different skins on a skill that mostly does the same thing. So for those that have missed the previous updates on this ability, I'll just kind of match together all of the changes that came in weeks 1, 3, and 4 of the PTS for a summary of what's going on with this skill. So they changed the base morph to Sacrificial Bones. Now the Blastbones you summon jumps at you instead of a target, and it gives you a 10-second buff that increases your damage done with class abilities and damage over time skills by 15%. The Stalking Blastbones morph has been renamed to Gravelord's Sacrifice, and this one extends that timer to 20 seconds instead of 10 seconds, and it also causes your Flame Skull ability and both of its morphs to deal AoE damage on their 3 stacked hit. So for those that are unfamiliar with Flame Skull, the way that it works is that every third cast of it deals 50% more damage. So now when combined with Gravelord's Sacrifice, not only will it deal 50% more damage on every third hit, but it will also deal that damage in a 6-meter AoE. This is pretty decent size. This is about the same size as your Boneyard, also the same size as the AoE from the previous iteration of Blastbones that you would fire at the target. So it's a strong AoE hit, has a pretty nice size to it, but it won't be there on every cast. If you do go with the magic morph, this stays as flame damage, and every third cast will also ricochet to up to 2 nearby enemies. Only that initial hit will deal the 6-meter wide AoE, but if the 2 targets that this bounces to are within that radius, then those secondary targets essentially take double hits from this third cast. So this is pretty cool, but it also ends up with a kind of weird interaction here, and we'll go through that a bit later in the pros and cons section. For the other morph, if you go with Venom Skull, this converts the skill to poison damage, and it now costs stamina to cast instead. It still has that 50% increase on each third cast, but does not have the bounce that Ricochet Skull has. So no double damage hits on anyone around, but instead with this morph, your other Necromancer skills all count as a cast towards reaching 3 stacks with this, meaning that you will be casting that Empowered Skull that gets the AoE and extra damage a lot more often with this morph. I think both of the morphs seem pretty good here. Probably we'll just go with the mag version if you're doing a Magicka-based build, and the stam version if you're going stamina-based. And then finally with Gravelord's Sacrifice, it causes your skull, either morph, to leave a corpse behind on that third empowered cast. So this should help resolve that issue of not having those consistent corpses that you normally would from casting your Blastbones every 3 seconds. So essentially what they've done with Gravelord's Sacrifice is move some of the lost AoE damage and corpse generation into Flame Skull, since you don't have it happening with your Blastbones. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe this is the first time we've had a skill specifically require another skill. We've seen some skill lines included in ability tooltips. An example of that would be the Ardent Flame line in Molten Whip, but with the Gravelord Sacrifice, you pretty much have to use Flame Skull or you're losing out on a ton of what the ability offers. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll go through the pros and cons of these changes in just a bit. For now, let's go over the other morph, Blighted Blastbones. This morph, they've mostly kept the same as what it previously was. This still has the 3-second cadence where you fire your Blastbones at the enemy. So for those that enjoyed that Necro playstyle, it is still there. You just have to swap your morph over to the stamina version now. They have reduced the stamina cost of this by quite a lot so that it's usable across a wider variety of builds. And that reduced cost combined with the reusable parts passive means it's going to be a very cheap skill to cast, and even cheaper if you have some medium armor pieces, which will also reduce the cost. And then another tweak they made is to add in a guarantee for the diseased status effect to apply with this. This means that not only will the targets have guaranteed major defile from this morph, but the minor defile from diseased. This is a fairly high reduction to healing and damage shields, so it's a nice debuff to add in PvP. However, in PvE, this part is not very useful. What is useful is the damage from diseased, and it's actually pretty nice that it is guaranteed now. So with update 41, they've gone through and updated status effects to be more universally appealing, and diseased got some nice buffs. I do have a video covering the status effect changes, as well as a bunch of other PTS videos linked down in the description below in case you missed them or need a refresher. So Diseased deals about double the damage that it previously did, and it also has a small AoE component to it now as well. This AoE part normally has a 4-second cooldown for the user. This doesn't seem to apply to Blastbones, possibly due to it being a pet and not coming directly from you. So it looks like every hit from Blastbones will include both the main Diseased proc and the AoE. I ran a few tests with a few skeletons lined up, and I always got both of these triggering at the same time. Don't pay too much attention to the specific numbers here. This was just a base character with no gear or stats applied. I was just checking how this worked. So what does this mean exactly for the overall damage from this skill? Well, this is definitely a buff from the previous iteration of it. We can look at the base tooltips, and instead of 3600, we can now include that disease component that brings it up to 4071. So roughly a 13% increase here. However, one thing you have to consider is that this skill did already have the chance to trigger diseased, usually somewhere in that 15 to 20% range depending on your exact setup. So when we calculate the new increase, it's only fair that we include that we would have already been getting some diseased procs anyways, so probably more like a 10% overall increase in this skill's damage by making the diseased proc guaranteed instead of the regular percent chance like most status effects. So I say all this, but this is not bad. I think most people probably undervalued how much damage this would add in, but it seems pretty decent actually. And if you are using the Maelstrom two-hander, since this specifically adds to direct damage, your Blighted Blastbones plus both diseased hits each individually benefit from this set since they are 3 individual instances of damage. So kind of a cool little interaction there, and it can make it a bit more of a buff for this setup than for others. I think the comparison most will want to make though is not from Blighted to Blighted, but from what Stalking Blastbones could do previously to what Blighted will do now, since most that are sticking with this playstyle will be swapping morphs there. So when we factor in the guaranteed disease, it may initially look like a little buff for damage. However, we have to consider that Stalking had a minimum of 10% additional damage from its secondary effect, even if you fired it in melee range. Plus, it did have a chance to proc the burning status effect, so we can't leave that out either. So if we include that guaranteed status damage for Blighted, we have to at least include partial status damage for Stalking. So once we add those in, we're looking at pretty much neck and neck for these two here. So for solo or unoptimized scenarios, I don't think you'll really be able to notice a difference in the damage here, and you'll probably actually see a little bit of a buff if you're using that Maelstrom two-hander. However, in group play, Engulfing Flames from a DK is a very common debuff to have present, which adds in another 6% flame damage. So in scenarios where you do rely on having this, you will notice a small nerf here. This is likely negated mostly for situations where you might be using the Maelstrom two-hander, but without it, you are going to see a little bit of a drop off. And then finally, Incratus Behemoth is another factor. This isn't as common as having Engulfing Flames, but it is still worth considering for scenarios when it's present. So when we add in the 5% from that, you're starting to look at a decent sized nerf here from what the skill could do before. But ultimately, I think most people probably really won't notice a difference in their damage output from the skill, but in very optimized scenarios, you will be looking at a DPS loss swapping to Blighted from the old Stalking Blastbones. All right, now we've broken down the changes. Let's go through the good, the bad, and the ugly for Necros, and I'll start off positive, and then we'll talk about what still needs some work. First off, for the pros, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a great new playstyle option. At 20 seconds instead of 3 seconds, this really changes the cadence of the Necromancer a lot. And I'd actually love to see them go through and do this with more skills to really differentiate the morphs into feeling like completely different options rather than just different elements that kind of do the same thing. I'm really glad they didn't change both morphs. Definitely think that was the right call to leave the 3-second cadence in place on one of the morphs for those that enjoy how that feels. Could also see those that prefer the more laid back heavy attack builds really liking this new morph. It frees up a lot of time to use other skills, and the 15% bonus to dots from Gravelord's Sacrifice should buff the first 2 ticks of your lightning heavies as well. All right, for the second pro, they listened to feedback. One of the big issues with losing your 3-second Blastbones was that you lost a massive chunk of your AoE damage. So over the course of the PTS, they've added some of that back in by causing your Flame Skull to deal AoE damage on every 3rd cast now. They also changed it to include your Scythe in the abilities that get buffed by this morph. Originally, it was only the Gravelord abilities being buffed, but they changed that to include all Necro abilities, which makes the Scythe hit a little bit harder now. So with those 2 things combined, you should be able to make up some of that AoE that you lost from Blastbones. Another bit of feedback that they responded to was the lack of corpse generation without having the 3-second Blastbones. Having Blastbones as a 20-second ability really cut back on how many corpses you had going out. So adding in that corpse generation to every third cast of Flame Skull is going to help a ton to consistently have a corpse available. And not only consistently available, but at the feet of your desired target, instead of stacking corpses around yourself, which is what the earlier iteration of this ability had. So definitely a positive here, giving the player a reliable way to generate corpses on demand. Another pro is that this creates some cool new interactions. One I like a lot is with Venom Skull and Scythe. So not only are these both buffed by Gravelord Sacrifice, but if you go with Venom Skull, this morph counts other Necro ability casts towards that third cast. So for AoE scenarios, you could use your Scythe to build to 3 stacks on the Skull, and then fire the Skull, which deals AoE damage, then back to the Scythe. So you'd have a way, even with the single target spammable slotted, to not have to cast any single target skills in an AoE encounter. So I thought that was a pretty cool interaction. And then with that Skull hitting for 50% harder each time it's at 3 stacks, that's a really strong AoE spam. Scythe is not anything too crazy for upfront damage, but the 15% buff from Gravelord Sacrifice does pull it ahead of something like Whirling Blades before Execute, since they both previously shared that same 1799 base tooltip. Plus there's that guarantee to proc hemorrhaging with each hit of Scythe. So it really probably isn't until about 25% or so health remaining that Whirling would pass up Scythe when you consider those things, if you are using the Gravelord morph. Not to mention, it can be a great way to proc off balance for your group. So I think a lot of players who use this morph will really like this unique interaction here. And then there's also a new cool effect with Ricochet Skull. So it does that 6-meter AoE like Venom Skull does on every third cast if you have Gravelord's Sacrifice active. But also this skill already had the morph feature to bounce to enemies within 6 meters. So you can have a couple of targets take double damage from it every third cast. These hits are going to be insanely hard considering the skill does 50% extra damage on that third cast. Unfortunately, the main target you're focusing does not get the bounce, so no double damage there, but I'll talk about that more in the cons section in just a bit. And then finally, the last pro I'll go over is their buff to the Death Knell passive. This went up to 10% crit chance per Gravelord ability slotted. This is pretty spicy. Lots of builds will be sitting close to 100% crit chance while in Execute and just going off at the end of the fight. So I really like this buff here a lot. Overall, there are definitely some pros going into this patch. I do like the direction. I think they're on the right track, but there are also some big pain points that I think need to be addressed. So let's talk about the cons now. The first one here, and in my opinion, the worst thing about Gravelord Sacrifice, is that you cannot cast this ability unless you're already in combat. This feels really counterintuitive for a self-buff skill. I really don't like this stipulation. They've done similar things in the past with the Black Rose Dual Wield, for example. If you cast your Blade Cloak out of combat, you don't get the buff from this item set, so you have to waste a GCD in combat to activate it. And so we have the same thing here, except the ability is just grayed out. You can't cast it at all. And on top of that, it has that delay before it buffs you once you do cast it. So even if you use it as the first thing as soon as combat starts, you'll still have to wait that short bit for it to activate. This is going to make it feel really clunky, whereas if you could pre-cast it while running up to a group of enemies, it would feel incredibly smooth to use that way, similar to how you can already with the other morph. So I think for me personally, if they can fix anything with Gravelord Sacrifice, this would be my #1 priority. My next con is that they actually nerfed the damage from Gravelord Sacrifice from earlier on the PTS. It was 20% to your abilities instead of 15. I really don't understand this. They did add in the AoE to Skull and included Scythe in the abilities that got buffed, but Necromancer is universally agreed upon to be an underperforming class in both PvE and PvP, and even with the 20%, that really isn't going to change that. So to nerf it down to 15% just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I'd like to see that go back up to 20%, or for them to add in a little extra something there. Moving on to the next con. So with this same nerf, they also removed you from being able to treat yourself as a corpse with Gravelord Sacrifice. It's not the end of the world, but it does force you into using Skull as your spammable if you want to have enough corpses. The Blastbones that comes out every 20-second will only drop 1 now over that 20-second period. So if you want to use Force Pulse or the Vamp spammable or Rapid Strikes or really any other spammable besides Skull, you're only going to get 1 corpse from your Archer and 1 corpse from your Blastbones every 20 seconds. This will make empowering your boneyard and having a reliable corpse there for your tether pretty inconsistent, especially since the corpses won't be guaranteed to be around the target. The corpse from Skull will be at the target, so I think if you're using that spammable, you'll probably like this change just fine. But for those that want to use something else, it's going to create a pretty awkward situation with this new morph. Next up for the cons, another thing I alluded to earlier that is kind of awkward is with the Ricochet Skull morph of Flame Skull. This one already bounced to 2 nearby targets on the third cast, so now you not only get that extra damage, but the extra AoE from the third cast with Gravelord's Sacrifice active. So this is kind of cool. You get double damage to targets in range for that bounce, but neither the AoE or the bounce hits an extra time on your main target, so you end up with this weird situation where if you want to really optimize your damage on a priority target, every third skull cast you'll actually want to cast on a nearby target and have that AoE plus the bounce from it hit the main target. To me, this feels a bit awkward for a playstyle that seemed like they were trying to make it a little bit easier than the other Blastbones morph, so this might just be a slight oversight here. Maybe if the skull did a double tap on the main target and then bounced to a couple of secondary targets, this wouldn't feel like you had to do some really weird stuff to min-max your damage around this feature. Next up, another issue I've seen a lot of people have is that they took the Stalking Blastbones morph away, which was the higher damage morph, and they left the less desirable Blighted Blastbones version for that 3-second per cast playstyle. Now, as we talked about earlier, they did add in that guaranteed disease damage proc, which definitely helps. So in a lot of scenarios, I don't think people are really going to even notice a difference here. However, the fact that it is even nerfed in any scenario when Necro is already underperforming, it just feels a bit deflating, especially for those that have already been enjoying Necromancer and some more organized group content. Personally, I don't mind Blighted taking over for this role, and if Necros were buffed enough this patch to more than compensate for that, I think people would probably be fine with this. I don't even think that Blighted itself probably needs to be buffed. They could go that route, and it could work for sure, but something I admittedly overlooked a bit when previously covering this is that there are other places in the kit I could see them targeting before Blighted that would probably work better to put Necros in a good spot. So in the final section here of the cons, I'll just list a few of the skills that I think if they got some love, it probably makes swapping to Blighted not such a big deal for most people. It seems the big thing people are upset about is just being nerfed at all. So first up is Grave Grasp. This is a criminally underused ability. It has a really cool animation to it. Kind of reminds me of the Witch Doctor in Diablo 3 a little bit. There was a time when the Empowering Grasp morph was very popular for PvE support, but now this skill just doesn't really get used. I'd love to see them turn this into a proper damage ability. Necros don't really have a ton of damage skills in their kit compared to other classes, and there is not a whole lot that is appealing about this skill in its current form. So it seems like based on that and the look of the animation of it, it would be a perfect target for a new damaging skill for Necros. I'd personally love to see those animations from this going off amidst all the other cool Necro animations that we're used to seeing. I think this one would be an easy win to add some good damage to. Next up is their ultimate, Frozen Colossus. Right now these morphs feel like they overlap a little too much. They're kind of in a weird spot to me. Glacial gets a stun at the end and has 20 seconds on the major vulnerability instead of 15, and then Pestilent deals a tiny bit more damage, has the guaranteed disease on each hit, but ultimately they kind of do the same thing. I think it'd be cool to have Glacial give the nice long major vuln and maybe turn Pestilent into a more proper DPS ultimate, even if that meant lowering the time on major vuln or taking it away completely. The damage on it now is pretty low. In fact, it isn't even as strong as the Animate Blastbones morph of the Res ulti. That's the one that shoots out 3 Blastbones if you have 3 corpses when you res people. And it's way under skills like Meteor or the Fiery Rage ultimate. There's probably a number of ways they could go about this. Some easy ones would probably just be to make that third smash leave behind a big disease pool on the ground that dealt more damage, or if it applied a dot to all the enemies hit as well. Maybe a dot that deals more damage if you get all 3 hits off on the same enemy, but something like that to bring the damage up closer to more desirable DPS ultimates. Next up, we have the Skeletal Mage. The Arcanist is the AoE morph, and it just feels like it doesn't really do much compared to other abilities like this on other classes. The damage on this is just kind of meh, and typically abilities that are on the lower end for damage like this have some other kind of function to make them interesting, so I think either more damage on this or a secondary function could be pretty cool here. And then the Skeletal Archer is the single target version, and it's actually pretty good DPS, especially for a 20-second ability. The problem here is that it will often target the wrong enemy. And same with the other morph too, it's just less noticeable since that one deals AoE damage. But if you're fighting against a boss, this archer will likely spend most of its time on little ads that don't really need to be targeted. So I think just fixing that would probably be okay to make this a really desirable skill. Maybe some other way to direct it with your Blastbones or Skull or a heavy attack or anything really to make it go to the right target. The ability itself is not too bad though for this morph, but I think the AoE Skeletal Arcanist morph could use some work. Next up, we have Summoner's Armor. I think this one could be cool to have a little offensive power on it too, instead of that cost reduction, or maybe some tie-in with Bitter Harvest, where if you have the Summoner's Armor active, you could raise the corpses siphoned into little skeletons that last for 60 seconds or something. Could create some really cool interactions, I think. I know a lot of people have said that the Bone Army aspect of Necros is the one that's missing from ESO that they really wish that it offered. But those are just a few skills that I think could be tweaked to add in a little power into the Necro kit so that they can use more of their class abilities to do more of the things you typically expect from a Necromancer. So to sum it all up, I do think they're on the right track here. I think a lot of people are going to really like the new morph and the playstyle that it offers. And I think end of the day, most people that like the old playstyle will be okay with Blighted when everything settles. But I will say it does feel a bit unfinished. The in combat only condition, again, that one is really disruptive. Also being forced to use Flame Skull with the new morph of Blastbones, or else you have too few corpses. I think they just have a few more tweaks to make. But honestly, after spending a bunch of time to research and really dig into the Necro kit, it seems like it's really the other parts of their skill lines holding them back more than what's going on here with the new changes. So hopefully we can see some of that addressed for the new chapter coming up in June. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this video helped break down the changes and highlight the current state of Necromancers. Let me know what you all think if you have any other ideas for the future of Necros to get them in a little bit better spot. Big shout out to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai 1212, Santanico, Vajriti, Florian, Phoenix, Nalandia, Unemployed, Chryseliana, Cha-Cha, Technical KO, Cap, Danco77, and Pletpron. Thanks again and see you later. Bye.